I feel like in North America, there's very much kind of a romanticization of like the single artisan frame builder, and then like the mass-produced stuff is just like trash.
They weld the number of bikes in a week that I've ever welded. They're so much more skilled than I am or ever will be.
If you've ridden a high-quality steel production bike, chances are it was made by the Maxway factory in Taiwan. A lot of bike manufacturing is shrouded in mystery and secrecy. In this video, we get a behind-the-scenes look at the Maxway factory through the eyes of Adam Sklar. I think Adam brings a pretty unique perspective to this discussion, having built frames as the solo artisan frame builder for the last decade, but recently he's also branched out into production bike manufacturing. I'm super stoked to bring this interview to you guys. And if you like this content that's just not focused on how you can become a pro cyclist, then join us on Patreon. We don't do sponsorships or paid placements on the channel, so that gives us a lot of editorial freedom, but at the same time, it takes teamwork to make the dream work. So join us on Patreon or consider picking up a sticker. Let's get into the video. Let's catch up a little bit. So you made the big move from Bozeman to California. Where'd you end up at, and how's it been?
Yeah, so I'm now living in the Bay Area. I living in Berkeley, and the studio where I'm now is in West Oakland, and it's been great. So nice to be able to ride through the winter, meeting lots of lovely bike people and the nice diverse bike scene that they have here.
Those Montana winters can break you.
I did 12 of them, and I think that was maybe 4 too many or something for me.
So it also looks like you're starting to build some customs right away. Are you catching up on the old orders, or are you taking in new ones?
Basically, the plan moving forward, I have this nice space here where I did my first batch of bikes in here a couple months ago. So moving forward, I'm not doing any more custom bikes, but I'll be doing, I guess I'm calling them micro batches. They're really like 3 to 5 bikes that are going to be the super duper high end hand built stuff. And that'll really work as a way to test out ideas for production, or to build something I just think is cool or people are asking for. Like if enough people want a titanium fixed gear that clears 55C tires.
It's
And
kind of
then
like a skunk works workshop.
totally, yeah, which is super helpful to be able to still build stuff. And like I'm working on my PBJ with the Taiwan production people right now, and that was the batch I just built. So it's really helpful to, like, while you're going through the drawings and doing all this communication with the factory, it's cool that I have just built the bikes and I kind of know issues that come up.
So when you build like let's say a micro batch or a custom bike, and when you take that to production, are there things that you have to change to simplify the manufacturing, or is it kind of a one-to-one translation of what you do in the workshop?
I think I'm getting closer to having it be one-to-one. Yeah, there are some things that I can do. If I am making changes, it's typically for the better. Like instead of me having to 3D print a part or use off-the-shelf stuff, when I'm doing production, I can open tooling to make exactly what I want.
Let's talk about your trip to Taiwan. What was the impetus to going over there?
I mean, I hadn't been to Taiwan before. This was my first time. I started working with some factories over there about 2 years ago to do the Super Something. My friend Daniel wanted to come as well. He works with a brand called Newhouse Metalworks and then is starting his own brand called Artifact. Super smart engineer, kind of a bike industry outsider, which is fun because he's super smart and doesn't have the baggage of being in the industry for so long. So I really like his perspective. He asks why on a lot of stuff that I'm like, that's just how we do it. But those open some really nice conversations when we were over there. Yeah, we were just curious to learn about how the manufacturing works over there. Of course, it's nice to go see the factories firsthand, and I've trusted the partners that I work with, and I've met them over here at like Sea Otter and stuff like that. But really nice to just go see in person. Also, for some of the design stuff, we'd have like a 20-minute conversation that probably saved like 8 months worth of emails and go through stuff in person.
Prior to this, like all your communications with the factory have either been through like just phone calls or Zoom, or when they came over to Sea Otter?
I don't get to have a ton of communication directly with the factories because I work with a trading partner who, I mean, they're experts, and the one I work with is behind most of the brands of bikes that that come through Pathless Paddle really. Like they work with
Yeah.
everyone, and they're Taiwanese, so they speak the language, they understand the manufacturing culture. They're really great partners to have, and they're basically who is tour guiding us around to all the, because it also takes, just because the frame is made at Maxway, there's another 5 factories involved before stuff even gets to Maxway. So it was cool to see, the casting house where the dropouts are cast, and where the tubing comes from, and then, all the bolts that hold on the cable guides and the cable guides and machine tracers, all these little parts, and lots of design decisions that happens at each of those steps.
How many days were you over there, and what did you see?
12 days total, and we started in Taichung, which is really where most of the manufacturing happens. Part of why bikes cost less from Taiwan is because everything is really close together. Like there's sort of the central area where Maxway and some of the other stuff is, but everything we went to is within an hour drive. And so we did a couple days. We got to see Maxway, where super somethings are made. They're known for doing Surly, All City, like a lot of those brands. And then we're going to see Aura, which is a really fancy factory where my new mountain bikes are made, which was really cool shop. Some paint shops. We got to see the casting house. That one was really exciting. We got to spend a weekend there, which is fun. We took the U bikes out. They're like the city bikes, and ended up finding this super fun bike path. And we went to the Giant, is obviously well, I guess Giant is in Taiwan, in Taichung, huge factory, biggest bike factory in the country. We went to their little museum, little propaganda center. It was fun. Yeah, and then lots of factory visits, like a handlebar factory, went to a tire factory, went to a factory that makes headsets and bottom brackets, because most of the frame factories don't actually make forks. Factory visit. It was really cool.
Were any of your bikes in production while you were there, or were they not queued up yet?
No frames. We got to see the stems I'm having made at that shop, Menkai, but no frames. They had just finished the samples of the mountain bikes.
Was it like you expected, or was it completely different from what you imagined?
It was a little bit of both. Daniel and I had talked about the biggest takeaway is that there's nothing that magic about it. The shops a lot of them are these like family businesses, and they're just a shop that has some pretty specialized tooling, but nothing like, there's not like some magic bike machine there. They're really efficiently set up, and they work really hard, and they just make a lot of bikes. They're just more efficient than us at it, which was really the big takeaway. I mean, I visited so many frame shops in the US. If there's ever one nearby when I'm traveling, I typically try to stop by, and it reminded me a lot of those. They're just big factories with nice bike machines.
What kind of machinery or what efficiencies did they have that most like single operators don't have?
I mean, so if we're talking about like Maxway, their whole thing was really one person, one tool, one job. Sort of material comes in one side, so the tubes, they could source the tubes from several different places. And then, like as we were walking through this mitering zone, we watched one guy. There's one giant press that, if I was making a chainstay in my shop, I would have to do one bend and then do the second bend, and I'm making sure it's exactly in phase, and then I dimple it, and that one chainstay probably takes me like 20-30 minutes. Whereas we were walking through this mitering zone, and this one guy probably dimpled like 100 chainstays while just ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. And so it just doesn't take long, because they make specific tooling for each frame size. Really gets that tooling. Next to that person was someone, drilling bottle boss holes with a drill that has 2 heads, so it drills them both at once. Yeah, I mean, there's so many cool things in there. All the braze-ons are spot welded on. They're like tacked on with these cool kind of lever presses. And so they get brass brazed on after, but that was everything out. So they're all perfectly aligned and ready to go for a guy who has a double-headed torch that's like every little process seems to be really thought through, and really specific tooling for each one. But also like tooling that I've seen in different shops around the US.
How many stations do you think there were to complete one frame?
That's a good question. A lot. For example, like the welding was really cool to see also. It's very like assembly line style. So there's one person doing front triangles, but then they pass those on to the person who tacks on the chainstays. And then there's one person whose job is to just weld the chainstays. And then it goes to the person who tacks the seat stays on. And one person just welds seat stays to the seat tube, and one person welds the dropouts. So there were probably means there's like eight or 10 welders on the line for each frame. And similarly, like we were just walking through the welding zone, and at the end there was one frame on a like pallet rack, and then by the time we were done walking through, there were like 6 frames stacked up there. They're just so quick.
Do you know if they work on or frame types at once, or do they just do them like in a big batch? Let's say today is just all like size 52 super somethings, and then
Right.
yeah,
Typically, they're going to do one order at a time. So yeah, if they were doing super somethings, the way it moves through the factory is, they're going to miter all the 52s, and then those move on to like brazons, then welding, and then once the material for the 52s is done, the 54s are coming through. So they're going to work on the same one size at a time. They said it takes about an hour to do a tool change for each size. That's pretty substantial time for them. They're doing a lot of bikes. Maxway was doing 40,000 a year. That was our takeaway. Was just like, oh, having both built frames, it was just like, oh, they just work really hard. And the history of manufacturing there is kind of interesting. It's steel bikes came over there really during, like, kind of after the 70s bike boom. There was a lot of the actual, like, machinery was in Japan, and then the reason it's in Taiwan is because Taiwan was cheaper at the time, so uh, the tooling went there. And then as the bike industry kind of moved on from steel, the base of their manufacturing infrastructure came from the BMX boom that happened in the 80s. And so they were one of the first places to specialize in TIG welding, and so that allowed them to be big in mountain bikes when mountain bikes were coming up in the 90s. And so they really went on that path of like TIG welded steel frames. And then as more stuff moved away, they became more high end. Yeah, I guess the other thing to consider is these factories we went to are, they're the highest end factories in Taiwan. But it also is like where most of the bikes that we talk about. That's, I guess, the reason that we are interested in talking about it is because there seems to be a lot of guessing what goes on there. It's
I
just
think a lot of people like assume that it's just robots, and it just presses out bikes by
right.
the thousands.
They're entirely made by hand, like these factories that we're talking about. There are factories that do robot welding. Yeah, those are a really different price bracket of bike and a different style of bike. I guess that's something I would emphasize, is they're very much handmade bikes in the same way that I would be building a bike.
I feel like in North America, there's very much kind of a romanticization of like the single artisan frame builder, and then like the mass produced stuff is just like trash. How does that resonate with you after your visit?
That's the reason I wanted to go there as well, to have this to talk about, because I think I'm qualified, having done both sides of that. There's obviously romance about someone who rides and builds bikes and does all that, but these people they weld the number of bikes in a week that I've ever welded. They're so much more skilled than I am or ever will be. The quality is high, and the quality depends on the design. The other thing about outsourcing any manufacturing, whether it's in Taiwan or anywhere, the quality really comes down to the design and being able to design to the capabilities of a factory. But typically the factories are resistant to use some of the nicer materials that get used in US manufacturing, or even European, some more domestic manufacturing. And that kind of feels like that was sort of our goal going over there, is like, how can we work on making these bikes out of some nicer materials? I think that's one of the places where people maybe see the quality difference in a frame that's not made by a artisanal builder.
Did you get a sense of the reasoning why? Was it because of a cost thing, or was just something new that they didn't want to have to take into their really smooth workflow?
They have their workflow figured out. Part of it is the frames, like in some of the factories, they dent easy, the way they just like move them around. And so when we're using really thin wall stuff, they're typically more dent prone, which is something we're working on. I'm working now with tubing manufacturer they're called Velospec. They found the stock of old True Temper tubing. So if you're a tubing nerd, you might remember True Temper was who all the American builders were crazy about, and then they quit in like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So this Velospec stuff is a American-made steel stock. They process it, they send it to Taiwan, and then because it's like the nicest quality base material. So butted tubing starts out as just a round, straight tube, and then the quality of the final product, of course, depends on what you start with. And so this tubing is butted and heat treated in Taiwan and then sent back to the US for American builders use, which is another thing where you're like, it's crazy that when I'm building a frame, like, because I use some Velospec, I use some Columbus that comes from Italy, I use some Reynolds that comes from the UK, like, and then I use some of the American stuff as well. So I have 4 different, but all of it is in Taiwan at some point for some processing. That's part of it too, doing production stuff. I'm excited to be able to support or work with a brand like that to grow together. Like if I can be making lots of bikes out of that steel, then it would also make it available to other builders.
You had mentioned designing for production. Like, can you give an example of that?
When I'm building a custom bike, for example, I take into account like a rider's weight, style, like, a mountain bike to one person might be for cruising gravel roads and they could weigh 100 pounds and be 6 feet tall versus like a production bike might be anyone from 100 to 300 plus pounds. So that's the challenging part. I need to choose materials that should work well for both those people. Part of using nice materials, like the really thin walled stuff that rides nice and is stronger. Yeah, we just need to choose butting profile smart, and then also choose wall thicknesses and heat treatment that like doesn't get dented at the factory, that they're comfortable using. Working with Aura, they do their butting in house, and we were able to make a tube that doesn't exist. So it has an ovalized butt on it that so the top where it meets the head tube, it's thicker at the top and the bottom. Like a lot of bikes will have a gusset there, but this is a way to do that that's stronger, and then they get to heat treat the whole tube, which is stronger than welding a gusset and adding a heat affected zone. And so that's a way, yeah, to make a stronger bike. It ends up being the same cost because the time it would take to manufacture and weld gussets kind of it washes out with making a custom tube. Or like designing a yoke, like you could choose to oval or to dimple a chainstay, which is a good solution sometimes. Nothing is stronger or rides better than a tube. Sometimes if you want to squeeze like a giant tire in there and a double or a big chainring, like just making a yoke is the right answer. Yeah, that's a way where you're like setting the factory up to make a better product. And so like when I did that, instead of just using a plate yoke, we cast a yoke that's cast out of chromoly and then it's heat treated after. So it's really strong. Having built a bunch of frames, I know this is like an easier way to weld it. So I think I might be the first production yoke that ends in a round, which is exciting. I think it looks really nice. And it was like a way where I was able to set the factory up to make something that's looks good and is easy to manufacture and is strong.
So for something like that, how much back and forth did you have to go with to the factory until you got the finalized yoke design?
Oh, that was so much. That was actually hard because they have different. They're much more conservative with like chainring with clearances, and that's partly due to the ISO standards that most of these things test, unless you decide not to test them, which is something else I guess we found out. And you can do that if you want, but there is no requirement to pass testing. There's numbers that I've built my yokes to for the last, I don't know, 8 years that I've never had an issue with any kind of clearance, and they were like, that won't clear at all. And I was like, I'm pretty sure it will because I've done it a lot. And that took a lot of back and forth and also like when you're signing off, you really sign away. You're like, okay, we'll just do it to my numbers, because
Right.
they're pretty good about being like, this doesn't meet the Shimano spec, which is nice. It's nice to be checked. Like that's a good partnership. I guess this is what I'm finding is like the pushback it's beneficial for both of us because we get to build more unique bikes. I'd rather be doing that than there's no reason for another same old bike to be out there.
I want to go back to testing for a little bit. They don't do the testing, right? They send frames out and there's like a other body that does it, or do they do in-house testing there?
Most of the factories do the testing in-house, but the tests are really interesting, and that's something that Daniel and I talked a lot about. Is a lot of them don't represent the way that bikes actually fail. I mean, they're obviously, it's a baseline way to see whether or not a frame is strong, and when you have a standardized test like that, it does help you compare frame to frame. It doesn't take into account the way a frame is going to ride. It's only these strength tests. I don't know. That's one thing we were talking about is like Daniel and I want to do our own test lab that we can get data that more indicates ride quality of a bike.
Like we had Jeff Frame on, and he was like, yeah, the testing that they do doesn't make sense, and he thinks it's, his opinion, a lot of the old 90s mountain bikes that have been around since forever probably wouldn't pass like some of the modern testing, but they still, they still ride good.
Totally. And I mean, I would think that 0 of the frame builder frames that are built in the US would pass. And I think that's okay because they ride good and had like 2 bikes come back ever. It would be cool to set up a test shop like Carl Strong, who's in Bozeman at Pursuit. They built their own testing setup because they're doing carbon fiber road bikes and they're building all their own materials. And I think that's really interesting to see. They're like using that data to see when stuff breaks, but also to check out ride quality and things like that. And I think that's the kind of innovation that would be fun to work on.
Does Maxway incorporate any 3D printing into their factory?
Maxway's not doing any that I know of. 3D printing, the reason it's become popular in the frame building scene is because you can print just one thing and it's less expensive than machining it typically. It seemed like, I guess another thing we did go to the Taipei cycle show, which was another reason I was over there. Lots of 3D printing around there, especially if we're talking about titanium stuff, because titanium machining is very expensive. Titanium casting is even more expensive, but casting is really, for steel bikes, casting is a much better solution. You're making stronger parts that can typically be lighter. There is an upfront cost for tooling, so that we mostly use is called lost wax casting, where you open a mold, so you machine a mold that makes a copy of your part out of wax, and then they do like if you're doing this is how like lugs are made or most dropouts. So you put on a tree that has a big cone, and then there's like probably 20 or 30 parts, and then you dip that in porcelain and then some sand, and you do that a bunch of times until a mold builds up around the parts. Then you melt out the wax, and then you dump in your steel, and then you cut off all those parts. It's pretty efficient way to make a lot of parts, and that mold isn't that expensive because it just has to make wax. But you could use chromoly, you can use stainless, and those parts end up being really cheap and good quality. They can be really accurate. 3D printed parts are a compromise. They're not as good as a tube or a billet part. They typically solve a manufacturing problem. They're not really providing a higher quality product. I mean, in the end, that can save the customer some money, but performance-wise, you're getting a lower performance part out of a 3D print because they need to be overbuilt. So you'd be better off with a tube, in my opinion. The big thing I'd like to dispel, people are well compensated for their work. Like the quality of life there seems high. All these businesses are like cute family businesses. They remind me of like my parents had a construction adjacent company, and we'd show up and they'd like make us some tea, and there's like an interesting generational shift going on there, kind of similar to here, where a lot of these factories started in the 70s and 80s, and like at Maxway, Angel, whose dad Yi is one of the owners, is kind of taking over. She just graduated college and she's kind of like taking over a lot of roles. So there is an interesting generational shift I think we're seeing in both the US bike scene and over there, and they seem a little more open to growing with us and trying some new things. So I think it's a really exciting time to be working over there. Yeah, and also that all this stuff is handmade, and it is the romantic handmade artisanal bike.
How old were the people? Were they like old welder dudes, or were there young folks?
There were like some people who had been there for like 30 years, and then a lot of the workers were probably younger, like 20s or something. And I guess that's another takeaway that we had, is that manufacturing is a hard and dirty job, and there's really no way to get around that. So the conditions are good, but at the end of the day, these are in the same way that it's dirty and I'm breathing in fumes when I'm welding bikes here, like they're also having that part of it. So.
Let's wrap up and talk a little bit about the Taipei cycling show. I saw pictures from there. It looked pretty cool. What were the big trends that you saw?
Yeah, so the Taipei cycle show, it's interesting because it's really a B2B thing. So it's mostly brands looking for like a stem manufacturer, frame manufacturer. So many mini velos, and now I want a mini velo. As far as metal bikes go, I mean, there's lots of the titanium integrated aero everything. For steel bikes, there's like a surprisingly lot of like Philip brace stuff and kind of things that looked like, I don't know, crusty. I think brands are looking at the American market and seeing that trend of, dare I say, alt biking as maybe the future of steel bikes. I actually went, it was actually fun. I walked around. Matt from owns Crust
Yeah.
was pretty much, I walked around with him the whole time at Taipei.
It's like,
And
that looks
that was really
familiar.
fun to see. We saw a 20-inch wheel cargo fork at one of the booths, and I was playing it cool. I was like, you know, what's the price on these? What's the minimum? And then I handed him my card, and he was like, oh, I know this. And then Matt was playing it cool, and then he's like handed him his card with the crust on it. He was like, how about this brand? Do you know this brand? And that's it. I guess that brings up an interesting point about intellectual property over there. I think they view it a little differently. I think you risk that anytime you outsource manufacturing. Um, it's a it's a relationship with the manufacturer, and you're teaching them. You can certainly go to these factories and say, here's the geometry I want, please make me a bike, and plenty of brands do that. But if you're designing a bike and you're introducing new ideas, those will probably get passed on to the people who do come and say, here's the geometry I want, can you just make me a bike eventually? And I can't really blame them. They're great ideas that we have, us innovative brands. You also would see stuff like there's a stem and you're like, oh, that brand's, I've seen that before. Or like a handlebar, which as a bike nerd is kind of fun. There's only so many factories that make the really nice stuff. And that was also cool to see, like, that a lot of the brands that we see in the US scene, these smaller brands, they're all using the nicest factories. I think other stuff, I saw an interesting product that was like a spring you put on between your seat post and your saddle, so it clamps into the seat post clamp, or yeah, seat post clamps it onto your seat post, like has false rails, and then has another clamp that you put on your saddle. It's like a spring. I thought that was pretty interesting. But it was fun to go see, like, as a frame building nerd, like all the lugs from Allotech and all the dropouts, to see them all in person. You're like, oh, here's that one that I've seen in a catalog. The industry's in a funky place. That was what people were saying. I mean, it was my first time going to Taipei, but there are plenty of industry people who've been there every year for forever. And it seems like in a time like this where sales are down for everyone, there's kind of less kooky innovation going on and people are kind of sticking to what they know. I guess that's my takeaway in the bike climate. It seems like people are going to be playing it safe for at least the next couple of years.
If you guys enjoyed this interview, please consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon. All the links below. And as always, keep the supple side down.